A homeless woman saw a suited man forget a briefcase in a cafe. When she opened it and saw bundles of cash, she decided to return it, not knowing who its true owner was or what he would offer in return. The city awoke beneath a grey blanket, damp and cold. Mary, wrapped in a worn coat, walked through the streets she knew all too well. Every corner whispered stories of a better past, of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, not to avoid the stares of passers-by, but because the daily grind had turned that gesture into an automatic reflex. She knew that for many, she didn't exist. The city could swallow a person whole, as if they had never been part of it. Near midday, the winter wind grew unbearable, and Mary headed to one of the few places where she could find shelter for a while without being turned away. A small cafe in the center, busy yet cozy. She entered, feeling the immediate change in temperature, and moved to the most secluded corner where she usually went unnoticed. She had just a few coins in her pocket, enough for a coffee that would warm her numb hands for a moment. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, and Mary, grateful for a moment of calm, observed the others closely. Customers chatted in whispers, the clinking of cups filled the silences, and the city's noise faded to the view outside the window. That's when she noticed him. A man rushed into the cafe, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that accentuated his tall, slender figure. Everything about him radiated urgency and power. Mary caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye as he moved confidently, as if he controlled time and space around him. He quickly ordered a coffee, made a brief call, and before his drink could cool, he left as swiftly as he had entered. Mary turned her attention back to the cup in her hands, but something nagged at her. She looked over and saw the black leather briefcase the man had left behind on the table. At first, she thought he would return for it, that someone in such a crowded place would notice and return it to him. But time passed, and no one seemed to acknowledge it. The briefcase gleamed under the cafe's warm light, like a signal only Mary could see. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to continue sipping her coffee, finish it, and leave without a second thought. But another part, one that had been dormant for too long, urged her to act. She slowly got up, almost fearing someone would stop her, but no one did. In a swift motion, she grabbed the briefcase and exited the cafe, feeling the weight of the leather in her hand. The streets were colder outside, and the wind seemed to whisper doubts in her ears as she walked away. She strolled a few blocks before stopping in a secluded alley. Her heart raced, and her hands trembled as she touched the briefcase's clasp. Around her, the city carried on, unaware of her small moral crisis. Mary took a deep breath, and after one last look around, she opened it. The sight hit her like a slap. Bundles of cash, neatly organized and stacked, filled the briefcase. It took her mind a few seconds to process what she saw. It wasn't just a small sum, it was a fortune, far more than she had ever seen in her life. Alongside the money were perfectly organized documents, but she lacked the courage to read them. In that moment, her attention was solely on the cash. Her thoughts swirled. With that money, she could escape the streets, rent a small apartment, buy new clothes, and decent food. She could start over. Her life, which had sunk so deeply into misery since Andres' death, could take a turn. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be possible. The thought of rebuilding her life with that money began to seduce her. But then, like a cold gust piercing her mind, guilt arrived. What was she doing? The money didn't belong to her. She didn't know to whom it belonged, but she had taken it, and just the thought made her feel dirty. Mary was not a thief. She never had been. Despite all she had lost, despite everything the world had taken from her, she had kept her morals intact. But now, with the temptation of money before her, all of that seemed to tremble. She shut the briefcase abruptly, as if trying to close off the thoughts that tormented her. She couldn't keep it. She knew that if she did, something within her would break forever. With hurried steps, she returned to the shelter that night. Doubt consumed her, and she needed to talk to someone. Haley was waiting in her usual corner, wrapped in dirty blankets. Mary sat beside her, and after a long silence, she told her everything. She spoke of the suited man, the briefcase, the money. Haley listened in silence, but when Mary confessed she didn't know what to do, her friend burst into bitter laughter. "What do you mean you don't know what to do?" Haley said, her tone laced with skepticism. "Keep the money, Mary. That guy probably won't even notice. To him, it's just loose change." Mary looked at her, feeling small and foolish. Haley was right, wasn't she? That man, Richard, would likely not feel the loss at all. But then, why did she feel that something was terribly wrong? Why did she feel that keeping the briefcase would turn her into someone she didn't want to be? That night, sleep eluded her. The briefcase remained beside her, like a watchful presence that wouldn't let her rest. No matter how much she tried to convince herself that it was the opportunity she had been waiting for, her conscience tormented her. The weight of the money wasn't just physical, it was moral, and Mary knew that if she took that path, there would be no turning back. At dawn, exhausted and her mind in chaos, Mary finally made a decision. She would return the briefcase. She didn't know how, nor what would happen next, but something inside her told her it was the right thing to do. Doing the right thing had always been her anchor, and she wouldn't let it go now, not when she was on the verge of losing the little that remained of herself. She left the shelter with the briefcase in hand, determined to find the suited man. She had no idea that this choice would lead her into a new chapter of her life, one that would drag her into a world filled with shadows, secrets, and darker truths than she had ever imagined. The walk to the shelter felt long and heavy. Mary felt that the briefcase she carried in her hand grew heavier with each step, as if inside it was not just money, but also the weight of a decision that would change her life forever. As she moved through the grey streets, a storm of thoughts flooded her mind. She arrived at the shelter as the sun began to hide behind the buildings. The last rays of light struggled to pierce the clouds, barely illuminating the worn walls of the refuge. Mary, exhausted both physically and mentally, crossed the door with trembling steps, knowing she wouldn't be able to sleep until she found an answer to what she should do. Haley sat in her usual corner, lighting a cigarette with the worn lighter she always kept in her pocket. Upon seeing Mary, she looked up with her usual expression of indifference, but noticed something different in Mary's eyes, a mix of anxiety and desperation that raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong?" Haley asked, slowly exhaling smoke as she watched Mary with curiosity. Mary sat down in front of her in silence for a few seconds, feeling the urgency to vent, but unsure how to start. The noise of the other people in the shelter faded as she concentrated on the words she couldn't find. Finally, she broke the silence. "Today, in the cafe," she began, her voice trembling, "a man left this." She placed the briefcase on the floor in front of Haley. The black leather gleamed under the dim light of the shelter, almost as if it had a life of its own. Haley lowered her gaze, observing the briefcase for a few seconds, before looking back at Mary, waiting for an explanation. Mary took a deep breath and told her everything. The suited man, the forgotten briefcase, and how, after leaving the cafe, she had opened it to discover a fortune in cash. "Haley, there's so much money here. Bundles and bundles of cash. More than I've ever seen in my life," Mary said, her voice quivering slightly as she recalled the image of the neatly stacked bills. Haley calmly extinguished her cigarette. Her expression hardened as always, but her eyes revealed a spark of interest. "So what?" she finally said, her tone dry. "That's what's bothering you, right? That you have a blessing in your hands and don't know what to do with it." "It's just that it doesn't belong to me, Haley," Mary replied, staring intently at her. "I can't keep it. I feel, I don't know, dirty just thinking about it." Haley let out a bitter laugh, so loud that some of the other residents turned to look. "Wow, Mary, you have a golden opportunity right in front of you. You shouldn't feel bad. Do you think that man is going to notice something's missing? Haley looked at her skeptically. Those guys have so much money that they don't even miss it. Besides, who else would use that money better than you? You're surviving on the streets, for God's sake. If anyone deserves a stroke of luck, it's you. Haley's words fell on Mary like a hammer. Was she right? With that money, she could escape the streets, rent an apartment, maybe even help Haley. For a moment, the idea of taking it began to grow in her mind. After all, life had been relentless since Andres' death. She had lost everything, her home, her security, and most importantly, the only person who mattered to her. Didn't she deserve a second chance? But something inside Mary wouldn't let her succumb so easily to that temptation. She looked at Haley, who was watching her with her typical mix of disdain and weariness. For Haley, life on the streets had hardened her heart. She had given up hope that the world would offer her anything but suffering. Mary, on the other hand, had always believed in kindness, that life could change if one did the right thing. Why should it be different now? I don't know, Haley. Something feels wrong. If I keep this, what will I become? Mary murmured, more to herself than to her friend. Haley rolled her eyes and took a long drag from her cigarette. What will you become? You'll become someone with money in her pocket, Mary. Someone who can eat every day. Someone who doesn't have to sleep with a dirty blanket on the floor of a shelter. That's what happens. Don't overthink it. But Mary couldn't help it. That night, while Haley slept peacefully, Mary tossed and turned in her blanket, unable to find peace. Thoughts tormented her like a swarm of bees buzzing in her mind. She imagined herself in a small apartment with clean clothes, a soft bed, and a new life. But that dream was always overshadowed by a shadow, her conscience, reminding her that the money wasn't hers, that she had taken it. What if that man needed the money for something important? What if someone got hurt because of her decision? Over and over, her mind repeated those questions until finally, just before dawn, she reached a resolution. She knew what she had to do, even if it wasn't what she liked most. She was going to return it. It was the right thing to do, and even if that meant continuing her hard life, facing the same struggles, Mary couldn't allow herself to lose the one thing she still had intact, her morals. Deep down, she knew the money could change her life instantly, but she also knew it would change who she was at her core. When the sun began to timidly rise, Mary got up, her decision made. She tucked the briefcase under her coat, ready to face the new day and find the suited man. She didn't know if she would find Richard, or how he would react when she did, but something inside her told her she had to return that briefcase. The feeling of relief in her chest confirmed that she was on the right path. Somehow, Mary felt her life was about to change forever, though she couldn't yet imagine how. The morning sun weakly illuminated the streets as Mary walked toward the cafe where it all began. She held the briefcase tightly against her side, feeling the physical and emotional weight she carried with her. Her decision was made, but that didn't make what she was about to do any easier. Each step she took was accompanied by a torrent of doubts and questions. What would she say to the suited man? What if he didn't believe her? What if he reacted unexpectedly? Mary had decided to return the briefcase, but she couldn't control what would happen next. She arrived at the cafe with a knot in her stomach, entering with the same caution as the day before. At first glance, everything seemed the same. The aroma of coffee filled the air, and customers occupied the tables speaking in whispers. But Richard, the suited man, was not there. Mary suddenly felt disoriented. What if he never came back? Her gaze scanned the room, searching for a clue. She approached the counter with some trepidation. The young, thin barista looked at her with a mix of surprise and distrust, as if he already knew Mary wasn't a regular customer. Still, she gathered enough courage to ask him, "Excuse me, the man who was here yesterday, tall, in a dark suit, he left this." Mary pointed to the briefcase, her hands trembling slightly. She felt like an intruder in a place that wasn't hers. The barista furrowed his brow, but something in her words seemed to jog his memory. "Are you talking about Richard Montenegro?" he replied, his eyes studying the briefcase with curiosity. Mary nodded, her heart skipping a beat upon hearing the name. So Richard was his name, a man whose surname resonated with power and wealth, a man very far from the world of hardship she lived in. "Yes, he left this," Mary repeated, feeling her voice tremble a little. The barista observed her for a moment before shrugging. "I saw him go into the office of his company just across the street." He pointed through the window. "It's the glass building, the tallest one. You can't miss it." Mary followed the direction he indicated, and sure enough, across from the cafe stood a towering office building, a glass structure reflecting the cloudy sky. The contrast between that world of luxury and power and her own could not have been clearer. Nevertheless, Mary took a deep breath, thanked the barista, and stepped out, determined. The building intimidated her. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last. She didn't belong in that world, and she knew it. Yet her determination pushed her to move forward. She entered the imposing lobby, where people came and went in expensive suits with phones in hand. They glanced at her sideways, with indifference or confusion, as if she were an out-of-place apparition. Feeling insecure, Mary approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Richard Montenegro," she said, noticing the surprise on the receptionist's face. "Do you have an appointment?" the man replied, not hiding the skepticism in his tone. Mary shook her head. "No, but it's important. He left this," she pointed to the briefcase. "It's something he needs to get back." The receptionist looked at her with a mix of disbelief and surprise, but before he could say anything more, a firm voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" Mary turned to see a tall man with well-groomed grey hair, wearing an impeccable suit. His eyes were cold and calculating, and his gaze fixed on Mary with evident curiosity. It was Richard. Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. Now she was face to face with him. "Are you the one who found my briefcase?" Richard asked, wasting no time on pleasantries. His tone was not aggressive, but neither was it friendly. Mary nodded, lifting the briefcase to show him. Her heart raced. "You left it at the cafe yesterday," she said softly. "I found it, and I thought, you should have it back." Richard furrowed his brow for a moment, as if he couldn't comprehend the scene before him. He scrutinized Mary, noticing her simple clothes, her tired eyes, but also the honesty in her gesture. He extended his hand and took the briefcase, his gaze shifting from the object to Mary. "Thank you," he finally said, although his voice didn't reflect true gratitude, rather a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" he added, looking at her with scrutinizing eyes. "Why didn't you keep it?" The question surprised Mary. She didn't know how to respond at first, but after a brief silence, she looked up and met his gaze directly. "Because it doesn't belong to me. It's not mine." Richard studied her for a few seconds, as if analyzing every word, every gesture. In his world, no one returned something so valuable without expecting something in return. He was a man accustomed to everything having a price, and what Mary had just done didn't fit into that logic. "It's rare to find someone like you," Richard said, a slight smile of disbelief on his lips. "Nowadays, nobody acts like that without expecting something back." Mary felt a bit uncomfortable under his scrutiny, but maintained her composure. "I don't need anything," she said firmly, although a part of her knew that wasn't entirely true. She needed many things, but she wasn't willing to compromise her principles. Richard fell silent for a moment, as if debating with himself. Then he broke the tension with an unexpected gesture. "I offer you a reward for your honesty. The contents of this briefcase are important to me, and I want to thank you for returning it intact." Mary's heart raced. Money appeared before her once again as a way out, a temptation. But recalling her conversation with Haley and the days and nights she had spent unable to sleep due to doubt, she knew she couldn't accept it. She didn't want to feel indebted again or betray the reason she had returned the briefcase in the first place. "I can't accept it," she replied, shaking her head. "I've already done what I needed to do." The surprise in Richard's eyes grew even more pronounced. Who was this woman? She was a mystery that intrigued him more than he would have admitted. Almost no one in his life refused money, especially someone who clearly lived in hardship. "You're different, that's for sure," Richard said, crossing his arms and looking at her intently. "I don't see people like you every day." An uncomfortable silence filled the air between them. Richard, still processing what had just occurred, did something unexpected. "You know, I could offer you something more. Not money." He said this carefully. "A job. It seems you have an integrity that's hard to find. Maybe you'd be interested in working with me. Nothing complicated, just simple tasks you could handle." He paused, studying her reaction. "What do you say?" Mary hadn't expected that offer. Confusion washed over her, but it quickly turned into a wave of hope. A job? After so long surviving on temporary jobs and sleeping on the streets, was an opportunity to escape her misery finally presenting itself. The temptation was enormous, and for the first time in a long while, the idea of a better life seemed real. But there was also something unsettling about Richard, a cold distance that she couldn't quite decipher. "I don't know what to say," Mary replied, feeling vulnerable in the face of the proposal. "Think about it," Richard replied, offering a gentle smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This could be your chance to leave behind whatever you're facing. I promise it's not complicated. And besides, not every day do you encounter someone who acts with such honesty." Mary, still hesitating, nodded slowly. She couldn't dismiss the offer outright. She had lived too long struggling to survive, and this could be the opportunity she had been waiting for. However, she still didn't know what to expect from Richard or the world she was about to enter. "I'll think about it," she finally said, knowing she was already leaning toward acceptance. Richard nodded, satisfied. "Take your time, but not too long," he said, handing her a card with his information. "When you decide, call this number." Mary left the building feeling that something fundamental had just changed in her life. The briefcase was no longer in her hands, but now she carried a much more important decision. Would accepting Richard's job mean stepping into a completely new world, one she didn't fully understand? As she walked back to the shelter, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that, although she had done the right thing by returning the briefcase, life was now presenting her with an even greater challenge. She knew that the choice she made would lead her down an unknown and possibly dangerous path. But after everything she had experienced, could she afford not to try? The weight of a new opportunity rested on her shoulders, and even though the future was uncertain, Mary felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was in control of her own destiny. Mary accepted the job with Richard Montenegro. It wasn't an easy decision, but the need to escape the streets outweighed her doubts. What began as a simple job offer would soon transform into something more complex than she could have ever imagined. On her first day at Richard's office, Mary felt out of place. Everything around her exuded luxury and sophistication. The glass walls, shiny floors, impeccably dressed people moving with an air of importance. With each step, she felt the curious and sometimes disdainful gazes of the employees watching her pass. Mary couldn't shake the feeling of being an imposter in that environment, as if someone would discover at any moment that she didn't belong in that world. Just days ago, her life had been entirely different. At first, the work seemed straightforward. Richard assigned her basic tasks, organizing documents, coordinating calls, and scheduling appointments. Everything felt routine, almost monotonous. But from the very first moment, Mary sensed something strange in the office atmosphere. The feeling of being surrounded by a world that, while looking pristine on the outside, concealed something dark within, soon became apparent. Richard, always impeccable and courteous, kept a cool distance from her. Although he treated her with respect, Mary could feel that he was studying her. Every time he assigned her a task, it was as if he was looking for something in her reactions, something perhaps not evident on the surface. Richard seemed to always be a step ahead of everyone, as if he knew things that others didn't even suspect. However, what confused her the most were the conversations she overheard unintentionally. Often, Richard met with a group of men in dark suits in a private meeting room. Although the doors were always closed, Mary could catch snippets of conversations as she passed by the hallways. Agreements, discretion, under-the-table payments were words that recurred. Even though the names of companies and people they mentioned were unknown to Mary, she couldn't help but feel a shiver each time she heard those words. There was something in the tone of their voices, something that indicated that these were not just simple business meetings. One afternoon, while organizing some documents that had been handed to her, something caught her attention. Among the papers in a folder Richard had given her, she found the name of a company that felt all too familiar: Faro Construction. Mary felt her heart stop for a moment. That was the company where Andres, her late husband, had worked before dying in a tragic accident. That company had collapsed shortly after the incident, plunging her into ruin. The pain she had tried to bury for years began to resurface. How was it possible that this company appeared in Richard's documents? At first, Mary tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, but the more she thought about it, the more the suspicion grew inside her that Richard was somehow involved in her husband's company's downfall. She remembered how Andres had told her about the precarious conditions they worked in, the risks they faced without proper safety measures. Could there have been something more behind that accident? Was it, in some way, caused deliberately? Doubts began to accumulate in her mind, and the fear of uncovering the truth paralyzed her. Mary knew she was in danger of stepping into a world she didn't fully understand, a world filled with secrets that could destroy her if she wasn't careful. But at the same time, the anger and pain she felt over Andres's loss pushed her to seek answers. As the days passed, Mary found herself diving deeper into the shadows surrounding Richard. The cryptic conversations continued, and although she tried to stay on the sidelines, she couldn't help but listen. She began to notice patterns in the meetings, in the names they mentioned, and the places they discussed. But what troubled her most was that the more she silently investigated, the more she realized that Richard seemed to always be one step ahead. One day, while sorting through files in Richard's office, she met Rose, his wife. Rose was an elegant woman with a cold smile and eyes that sparkled with cautious intelligence. She lived a life of luxury, but something in her gaze revealed that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. The relationship between Rose and Richard appeared distant, almost as if they were partners rather than a couple. Whenever Richard entered the room while Rose was present, the atmosphere shifted. There was tension, a subtle discomfort that Mary couldn't ignore. "Are you the new assistant?" Rose asked, her tone polite but lacking warmth. Mary nodded, nervous under Rose's intense gaze. "Yes, I am. I'm Mary," she replied softly. Rose studied her for a moment, as if evaluating who she really was, then nodded, managing a tight smile. "My husband has a good eye for useful people," she said before walking away with a firm stride. That phrase echoed in Mary's mind for hours. Useful people? Mary didn't know whether to feel flattered or unsettled by those words. Rose, like Richard, seemed to weigh every word and action as if everything were part of a game whose rules Mary didn't understand. As days passed, Mary realized her intuition had been right. There was something deeply strange about Richard and Rose's lives. The tension between them, the secret meetings, the veiled words. Everything pointed to the fact that Richard was not just a successful businessman, but was involved in something much darker. One day, while reviewing some old files, Mary stumbled upon a name that took her breath away: Nicholas Smith, a lawyer who had worked for Faro Construction before its bankruptcy. She recalled how Andres had mentioned that name on more than one occasion. From that moment on, Mary began to understand that the company's collapse where her husband had worked hadn't been an accident. The pieces started to fit together, and the truth behind Andres's death was much closer than she had imagined. Despite the unease she felt, Mary knew she couldn't give up now. She was getting closer to discovering the truth, but she also understood that in doing so, she risked unleashing forces she couldn't control. Richard was not an ordinary man, and what he concealed could put her in danger. But there was something else Mary didn't know. Richard was starting to suspect her. In his world, loyalty was always put to the test, and Mary, with her past and integrity, was someone he still couldn't fully decipher. While he admired her honesty, he couldn't shake the thought that Mary might be seeing more than she should. The game was afoot, and Mary, unknowingly, was caught in the middle of it. Richard, with his calculating gaze, watched her in silence, aware that more and more truths were being revealed. And so, as Mary moved toward a truth that would change her life forever, she couldn't shake the feeling that every step brought her closer to an abyss from which she might not escape. The days in Richard's office had become tenser for Mary. Since she found the name of Faro Construction among the documents, she couldn't stop thinking about Andres's death. Each day felt like she was closer to uncovering a truth that had remained hidden in the shadows for years. The pieces began to fit, and Richard's always controlled and distant face took on new shades in her mind. She couldn't shake the possibility that Richard was somehow involved in the accident that killed her husband. Andres's company, which had abruptly closed its doors shortly after his death, had not just been a victim of mismanagement or bad luck. Something deeper and more sinister seemed to be behind its bankruptcy, and Mary was beginning to realize that the man she now worked for might be at the center of it all. Every night as she returned to the shelter, her mind spiraled around the same topic. She remembered the happy days with Andres, the moments they dreamed of a future together. Everything had crumbled so quickly. The accident, the company's closure, the lack of compensation. It had been blow after blow, leaving her without resources, without support, and ultimately without a home. For years, she had accepted the official version, a workplace accident, an unfortunate incident. But now, doubt had taken hold of her. What if it hadn't been an accident? What if there was something more behind the tragedy? One afternoon, while filing documents in Richard's office, Mary noticed something strange. A group of well-dressed men entered Richard's office, speaking urgently, but in hushed tones. They carefully closed the door, but Mary, who had learned to sharpen her ears, moved close enough to hear snippets of the conversation through the door. "We need to keep everything under control. If anyone discovers the connections to Faro, it will be the end." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. She froze for a moment. They had clearly mentioned Faro, the company where Andres had worked. Her suspicions were slowly confirming, but at the same time, fear consumed her. If they were mentioning Faro in these secret conversations, it meant that something dark was connected to that company, and likely to her husband's death. The words that followed were even more revealing. "We cannot allow those documents to come to light. If anyone finds out about the agreements we made with them, everything will come crashing down." Richard's voice sounded tense, much more than Mary had heard before. The agreements, the connections, everything was related. Trembling, Mary stepped away from the door before anyone could notice her presence. Her heart raced as she tried to process what she had just heard. It was evident that something had happened between Richard and Andres's company, something they had kept secret all this time. But what? And how was it all related to Andres's death? Mary knew she had to be careful. Richard was a powerful man, and if he had been hiding something related to her husband's death, she had no doubt he would do whatever it took to protect his secrets. But Mary could no longer turn back. She needed to know the truth, and now that she was so close, she wouldn't let fear stop her. That night, in the shelter, Mary stayed awake longer than usual. She couldn't share what she had discovered with Haley. She knew her friend was too practical to care about conspiracies or mysteries. For Haley, the world was simple. You take what you can to survive and move on. But Mary couldn't shake the feeling that she was destined to unearth what had been hidden for so long. She replayed the details of the conversation she had overheard in her mind. The agreements they mentioned had to be illegal, that much was certain. But how could she prove it? Mary knew she had to find those documents they had talked about. They were likely well hidden, probably under layers of protection, but there had to be a way to access them. There had to be a trail, something that would lead her to the truth. The next day, she arrived at the office determined. Cautiously, she began to sift through old files, searching for any mention of Faro construction or the names she had heard in Richard's conversations. The more she searched, the more her fear and anger grew. Every fragment of information confirmed her worst fears. Richard had been involved in her husband's company's collapse. The connection was clear, but she still lacked the key piece. It was then that her search took an unexpected turn. While organizing files in the meeting room, Mary found a document labeled "Confidential." Her heart raced as she opened it. What she read left her frozen. The accident that killed Andres hadn't been an accident at all. The document detailed safety issues at the company that had been deliberately ignored. Richard and his team were aware of these risks, but chose to do nothing to avoid impacting their cash flow. The names of several politicians and business people appeared on a list of those bribed to cover up the truth. Andres hadn't died from a mere workplace accident. He had been a victim of the greed and corruption of people like Richard. Mary felt the air escape her lungs. She had been working for the man who, directly or indirectly, was responsible for her husband's death. Her pain transformed into a contained fury. Everything she had endured, misery, loneliness, desperation, was a consequence of Richard's decisions and others like him. But Mary knew she couldn't act impulsively. Richard was a powerful and dangerous man. If he discovered that she knew the truth, he would destroy her without hesitation. She had to be cunning. Now that she understood the game, she had to play it smart. She needed allies, someone who could help her expose the truth without putting her life at risk. With the documents in hand, Mary left the office that night, knowing her life had changed forever. The truth she had uncovered not only affected her past, but also threatened her future. Richard had to pay for what he had done, but to achieve that, Mary would have to walk a fine line between justice and survival. As night fell over the city, Mary vowed to herself that she would find a way to expose Richard. It was no longer just for Andres. It was also for her, for the life he had stolen from her, and for all the people who had suffered at the hands of his greed. The battle was just beginning, and Mary was ready to fight with everything she had. Mary's discovery about Andres's death and Richard's involvement in the accident changed everything. Her life, already filled with difficulties, became a storm of emotions. Rage burned inside her, sorrow choked her, but fear kept her alert. She knew Richard was a powerful man, and that any misstep could cost her dearly. She needed help, someone to guide her through this dark world and support her in her quest for justice. And that's when Leonard appeared. Leonard was an experienced journalist, known for his ability to unearth corruption scandals in circles of power. For years, he had been following the trails of Richard Montenegro, suspecting his illicit activities, but he always encountered walls of silence and threats that kept him at bay. However, Leonard wasn't the kind of man to be easily intimidated. His obsession with exposing the truth had led him to risk his career more than once. Richard, with his network of contacts, money, and influence, was a complicated target, but Leonard felt he was closer than ever to finding the missing piece to dismantle his empire. What he didn't expect was that this key piece would be Mary. Leonard had heard about Richard's new assistant, but at first he didn't pay her much attention. She seemed like an ordinary woman, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But something changed when he began to investigate her further. he discovered her past. A woman who had fallen into poverty after her husband died in an accident at Faro Construction. That connection made him stop. Leonard knew Richard had been involved in the company's bankruptcy, but he didn't know how deep the link ran. He decided to follow Mary's steps, observing her from a distance, hoping to uncover if there was more to her than met the eye. One night, Leonard decided it was time to approach her. He saw her leaving the office building, tired and with an expression that betrayed the weight she carried. He followed her into an alley, ensuring she didn't see him until the moment was right. "Mary?" he called from the shadows. Mary turned abruptly, startled and frightened. Her heart raced, and her first reaction was to take a step back, preparing to flee. "Don't be scared," Leonard said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I don't want to hurt you. I just want to talk." Mary eyed him warily. A strange man in the darkness of night wanting to talk was not reassuring, but there was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that made her hesitate. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her distance. "I'm Leonard. I'm a journalist, and I've been investigating Richard Montenegro for some time." He paused, watching as Mary tensed at the mention of her boss's name. "I know who you are, and I know what you found." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. Did he know about the documents? Did he know she was searching for answers about Andres' death? She couldn't afford to trust him. If Leonard was wrong, he could expose her. But if he was right, maybe he was the help she so desperately needed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mary replied, trying to sound firm. Leonard smiled slightly, knowing she was on the defensive. "Yes, you do," he said softly, but with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "I know you're looking for the truth about what happened to your husband, and I know Richard is behind it all. If you let me, I can help you expose him." Mary's heart raced. Could she trust this man? Every fiber of her being screamed for caution, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. Since discovering the truth about the accident, she felt trapped. She couldn't go to the police, and she couldn't confront Richard on her own. Perhaps Leonard was her only option. "How do I know you're not working for him?" she finally asked, narrowing her eyes, searching for signs of betrayal. "If I were working for him, you'd already be dead," Leonard replied, his tone serious yet straightforward. "I've been trying for years to dismantle Richard's corrupt empire, but I always run into barriers. He has judges, politicians, and businessmen on his side. But you could be the key to bringing it all down. With what you know and what you've seen, we could take him down." Mary looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception, but she found none. Instead, she saw a determination that felt familiar. It was the same kind of drive that had led her to seek the truth about Andres' death. Leonard was willing to risk everything to reveal the truth, just like her. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped toward him. "What do you know?" she asked, feeling her voice tremble with a mix of fear and hope. Leonard led her to a nearby café, a discreet place where they could talk without being seen. There, at a secluded table, he began to explain everything he had uncovered over the years. Richard was not just an influential businessman. He was entangled in a much deeper network of corruption than Mary had imagined. From bribing public officials to money laundering, Richard had built an empire on rotten foundations. "It all started with the fall of Faro," Leonard said, looking at Mary seriously. "Richard and his partners used that company for a money laundering scheme. They needed to dispose of it once it had served its purpose, and they did so without caring about the lives they destroyed in the process. The accident that killed your husband, it wasn't an accident. It was a direct consequence of Richard's greed and his people." Every word from Leonard felt like a dagger to Mary's heart. Andres' death had not been a simple tragedy. It had been the result of corruption and Richard's deliberate negligence. The anger that had been bottled up inside her began to rise again, but this time she didn't feel powerless. Now she knew she had a chance to seek justice, not just for Andres, but for herself. "What do you want me to do?" Mary asked, her hands trembling slightly as she intertwined them on the table. Leonard smiled, relieved that Mary was finally willing to work with him. "I need evidence," he said. "You already have access to Richard's office. You know where to look. If we can find the documents that link Richard to the illegal agreements and to the bankruptcy of Pharaoh, we can expose him to the world. I'll take care of publishing it, of making sure everything comes to light. But you need to be careful. Richard isn't stupid, and if he suspects anything, you'll be in danger." Mary nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility she had just accepted. She knew Leonard was right. Every step she took from now on had to be cautious and calculated. She was entering a battle much bigger than she had anticipated, but she had no other option. "I'll do it," she finally said. "I'll get what you need." Leonard nodded, his gaze filled with respect for Mary's bravery. "You won't be alone in this. I'll have your back. We'll make sure Richard pays for what he has done." That night, Mary returned to the shelter, knowing that there was no turning back. She was at the center of a dangerous plot, but with Leonard's help, she felt that for the first time, she had a real chance at justice. Her quest for the truth had not only led her to uncover the corruption behind Andres' death, but had also put her on a path to bring down the man who had caused so much suffering. Now, with the plan in motion, Mary had to be smarter than ever. Richard had no idea what was coming, but Mary was determined that he and everyone who had aided him would face justice, no matter the cost. As Mary moved forward with Leonard's plan, she knew she had to be more careful than ever. Richard was a shrewd man, and while he didn't seem to suspect her yet, Mary couldn't let her guard down. What she didn't know was that for weeks, each of her movements had been monitored by someone much closer than she imagined. Nicholas, a private detective hired by Richard to keep a close eye on her. Nicholas was no ordinary man. He had worked for powerful people before, always maintaining discretion and executing his tasks with precision. He was the kind of man who, for the right price, asked no questions. When given the order to watch Mary, he thought it would be a simple task. To him, she was just an insignificant woman whom Richard had hired for some reason he didn't fully understand. However, as the days passed, Nicholas began to doubt the purpose of his mission. He had followed Mary on her comings and goings, observing how she moved cautiously in the office, how her expression changed whenever she found something in the documents. At first, he thought Mary was just snooping around, perhaps looking for personal gain. But over time, he started to notice something different about her. Mary didn't behave like someone looking to take advantage. There was a sincerity in her actions, a mix of fear and determination that confused him. It wasn't greed, as he had seen so many times in others he had followed. Something deeper was happening. Nicholas watched as Mary began to leave work later than usual, how she seemed more cautious, and most importantly, how she sometimes found herself in places outside the office that didn't fit her usual routine. That's when he saw her, one time, meeting with a man he recognized immediately, Leonard, the journalist. From that moment on, Nicholas knew things were not as simple as he had thought. Leonard was known in the darker circles for being a persistent man, someone who wasn't afraid to confront the powerful if it meant exposing the truth. Nicholas had heard of him and knew that if Mary was working with Leonard, what was at stake was much bigger than he had imagined, and that put him on alert. One afternoon, Richard called him into his office. The atmosphere in the office was tenser than usual, and Nicholas could sense the pressure in Richard's calculated gestures. He sat in front of his boss, awaiting instructions. "Nicholas, I need to know what Mary is doing," Richard said bluntly. His tone was cold and direct. "Something doesn't add up with her. She's behaving strangely, and I can't afford mistakes." Nicholas listened in silence, showing no reaction. He knew Richard was starting to doubt Mary, and that concerned him. For weeks, he had watched the woman without finding anything to incriminate her directly, but he also knew that if Richard considered her a threat, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her. "Keep watching her. I want a detailed report on every move she makes. And if you find anything out of place, Let me know immediately, Richard continued, his gaze fixed on Nicholas. I don't want surprises. Understood? Nicholas nodded, but as he stood to leave, something inside him troubled him. What was Richard really after? He knew that for Richard, everything was about power and control. But doubt began to grow in Nicholas. Was Mary truly a threat to Richard, or just a victim caught in something much bigger? That night, as he watched Mary from a safe distance, Nicholas found himself questioning his loyalty. He had worked for powerful men like Richard before, men who pulled the strings of power from the shadows, men who made disappear those who stood in their way. Nicholas had closed his eyes many times to what he saw, justifying his actions by the money he earned. But this time, something felt different. As he followed Mary through the dark streets of the city, he saw something that made him stop. Mary walked slowly, her gaze downcast, as if carrying an invisible burden. She was alone, vulnerable, and Nicholas couldn't help but feel a twinge of compassion. What had led her to this situation? What was driving her to confront such a powerful man as Richard? She didn't seem like an opportunist, nor someone seeking revenge for revenge's sake. Mary was different. In the following days, Nicholas began to observe the small details more closely. How Mary stopped in front of her husband's grave one time, her expression heavy with sadness and determination. How, instead of heading straight to the shelter after work, she would briefly meet with Leonard in discreet locations, always with the same caution. Mary wasn't playing a game for money or power. She was seeking justice. And that, in a world filled with corruption and lies, was something rare to find. Nicholas, who had always been a practical and unscrupulous man, began to feel uneasy about the mission he had been assigned. He knew that if Richard discovered what Mary was doing, her life would be in great danger. Could he allow that to happen? Nicholas found himself at a moral crossroads, one he hadn't anticipated. One night, as Mary left the office later than usual, Nicholas decided to approach her. His presence was silent, but Mary noticed him immediately. At first she was startled, taking a step back, but Nicholas raised his hands in a gesture of peace, just as Leonard had done weeks earlier. Don't worry, Nicholas said, keeping his voice low. I'm not here to hurt you. Mary eyed him warily. She knew Nicholas worked for Richard, and that put her on guard. What was he doing approaching her now? What do you want? Mary asked, her tone cold and contained. Nicholas sighed, knowing that his words could change the course of events. I've been watching you. Richard asked me to do it. Mary felt a chill at this revelation, but Nicholas quickly continued. But I'm not here to expose you. I've seen enough to know that you're not here for what Richard thinks. Mary frowned, still not fully trusting him. And what do you think I'm doing? She retorted, her voice filled with challenge. Nicholas looked at her intently, weighing his words before speaking. I think you're looking for the truth. And I believe that if you continue down this path, Richard will discover you. And when he does, he won't give you a chance to defend yourself. I don't want that to happen. Mary remained silent, processing what she had just heard. Why was Nicholas switching sides? For weeks, he had been her shadow, and now he seemed willing to help her. Why should you care about me? She finally asked, her gaze fixed on him. Nicholas sighed. It was a question he had asked himself many times. Because I'm tired of working for people like him. Nicholas's voice had a sincerity that surprised Mary. I've done things I'm not proud of, but you don't deserve what's going to happen if Richard discovers what you're doing. If you're truly seeking justice, I want to help you. But you have to be careful. Mary stared at Nicholas, trying to gauge if she could trust him. He had been part of Richard's world, someone who, until that moment, seemed to be on the other side. But now, Nicholas's desperation for redemption was palpable. Finally, Mary nodded. Okay, she said quietly. But if you betray me, I'll make sure you go down with him. Nicholas smiled faintly, nodding with respect. He knew Mary wouldn't be easily manipulated, and that made him admire her even more. "I won't betray you," he promised. "I'll help you get out of this, and together we'll make Richard pay for what he has done." With this new alliance, Mary felt stronger, though she also knew that danger was closing in. Richard was no fool, and with each passing day, the risk of being discovered grew. But now, with Leonard and Nicholas by her side, Mary was more determined than ever to confront Richard, to unearth the truth, and to seek justice for Andres. The battle was about to intensify, and Mary knew that, one way or another, the outcome was approaching. The atmosphere in Richard's office grew increasingly dense. Whispers in the hallways, furtive glances, and the rising nervousness among some employees were clear signs that something dark loomed over the entire building. Mary felt the tension each time she entered work, as if the walls themselves knew a secret was about to be revealed. With Leonard and Nicholas on her side, she had gained powerful allies, but she also understood that the dangers were more real than ever. Richard was not a man who easily forgave, and his web of contacts and power made him a formidable enemy. However, there was one person in Richard's life that Mary had been observing from the shadows, not fully understanding her role. Rose, Richard's wife. Always elegant, always immaculate, Rose maintained a cold and controlled facade, almost distant. To many, she was the perfect representation of a magnate's wife, but Mary was beginning to see cracks in that armor of perfection. One day, while Mary was filing documents, Rose entered the office unannounced. Her heels echoed firmly against the marble floor, and her presence always drew looks, not only for her beauty, but for the aura of authority she exuded. As she crossed the threshold, her cold eyes settled on Mary, but this time there was something different in her gaze, something deeper, more human. "Mary, right?" Rose asked, approaching with her typical air of superiority, but with an unusual tension in her voice. "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied, trying not to show her nervousness. She knew Rose could be both a threat and a potential ally, but she still didn't know how she fit into the puzzle. Rose studied her for a moment, as if evaluating her words before speaking. "I need to talk to you. In private." Mary blinked, surprised. What could Rose want from her? However, she kept her composure and nodded. She followed her to a small, empty meeting room where Rose sat down and gestured for Mary to do the same. Once the door closed, Rose's expression changed. The mask of coldness crumbled, revealing a weary face, and her voice, as she spoke, carried a tone of vulnerability that Mary hadn't expected. "I know what you're doing," Rose said, looking directly into Mary's eyes. Mary's heart stopped for a moment. Did she know? How much did she know? "I know you're looking for answers about your husband, and I know Richard is involved in all of this," Rose continued, with a distant coldness, but the truth laid bare without beating around the bush. Mary felt a knot form in her stomach. If Rose knew this much, the risk was far greater than she had imagined. She tried to steady her breathing and her mind, which was already searching for a way out of this trap. How do you know?" Mary asked, her voice trembling, neither confirming nor denying anything. Rose let out a bitter smile. "Because I've been watching Richard for a long time too," she confessed, her voice laced with resentment. "I haven't always been blind to what he does, Mary. I've lived beside him, watching how he destroys people and manipulates everything around him for his benefit. But what I didn't realize was the extent of his corruption." Rose paused, her gaze fixed on the table. "Until I started uncovering some things on my own." Mary looked at her in silence, absorbing what Rose had just revealed. Richard's perfect wife wasn't so perfect after all, and clearly she had been keeping her own secrets. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mary asked, still cautious. Rose lifted her gaze, her eyes brimming with a mix of sadness and contained fury. "Because I can't continue like this. Richard is not the man I fell in love with years ago, Or maybe he always was this monster and I refused to see it. I stayed by his side, blinded by a life of luxury, by power. But I can no longer bear living with the constant feeling that everything I have is built on the ruins of people like you. Her voice cracked slightly, but Rose quickly regained her composure. I've seen how he uses people, how he has corrupted judges, politicians, and businessmen. And if he continues like this, he will destroy me too. Mary remained silent, processing everything Rose was confessing. Was this a genuine betrayal of Richard, or was Rose just looking to save herself before everything crumbled? Perhaps it was a mix of both. I want to help you take him down, Rose said finally, with renewed firmness in her voice. I know that you and that journalist Leonard are trying to expose him. I can be your greatest ally in this, Mary. I have access to documents, accounts, information you could never obtain on your own. Mary narrowed her eyes, evaluating the proposal. Could she trust Rose? Nicholas had already shown that loyalties could change, but Rose was a cunning woman, and Mary knew she had her own interests at stake. However, if Rose truly wanted to help, her access to Richard's darkest secrets could be the key to bringing him down. Why now? Mary asked, still suspicious. Why have you decided to betray Richard? Rose looked at her intently, her dark eyes shining with a painful truth. Because I've discovered that Richard has no limits. Because I know that if something goes wrong, he will sacrifice me without hesitation to save himself. She paused, and for a moment her voice softened. And because... She took a breath, as if admitting what she was about to say was difficult. Because you remind me of me, before all of this consumed me. And if I can help you avoid what happened to me, then maybe, for once, I can do something good. Mary felt a wave of compassion mixed with distrust. Rose, despite her coldness and apparent distance, was broken inside. She had been devoured by Richard's world, and now she was trying to save what was left of her humanity. What do you want in return? Mary asked, knowing that a woman like Rose wouldn't take risks without getting something in return. Rose gave a bitter smile. I want to protect myself. I want to get out of this alive and with enough to never have to depend on someone like him again. I'm not a saint, Mary, but I'm not a villain either. I just want to survive. And if I can take Richard down in the process, even better. Mary nodded slowly. She knew Rose wasn't completely trustworthy, but she also understood that in this game, everyone had something at stake, and alliances were formed out of necessity, not trust. Rose was dangerous, yes, but she was also the best option Mary had to obtain what she needed. All right, Mary said, making a decision she knew could change the course of everything. We'll work together. Rose looked at her, and for a moment, a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. I'll make it worth your while, Rose promised, rising from the table with an elegance that seemed unbreakable. Then, before leaving, she turned to Mary once more. Be careful, Mary. Richard is smarter than you think, and if he suspects you, he won't hesitate to eliminate you. Mary watched her leave the room, her mind racing. Now she had Rose on her side, but she also knew that the move they were making was extremely dangerous. Richard was a man who did not forgive betrayals, and every step they took had to be calculated precisely. Mary had begun this fight seeking justice for Andres, but now everything was much larger. She was caught in a web of lies, corruption, and power, and with each passing day, the pieces on the board moved toward an inevitable confrontation. Richard's downfall was closer than ever, but so was the risk of everything crashing down, taking her with it. With Nicholas, Leonard, and now Rose on her side, Mary prepared for the next step in her plan. She knew things wouldn't be easy, and any mistake could be fatal. But she also knew that for the first time in a long time, she had a real chance to win. And this time, she wasn't going to fail. Mary felt the tension in the air. Everything she had planned with Leonard, Nicholas, and now Rose culminated in this moment. She knew there was no turning back. It was now or never. Every step she had taken up to this point, from returning the briefcase to uncovering the truth about Andres' death, had led her to the edge of an abyss, and now she had to leap with the hope that her plan would work. The plan, meticulously orchestrated, consisted of a precise strike against Richard, one that would strip him of his most powerful weapons, money and influence. Rose had been instrumental in the preparation. Through her connections and access to Richard's darkest secrets, she had provided the necessary information for Leonard to pull the strings in the media and, most importantly, with the authorities. Nicholas, for his part, had installed listening and surveillance devices in Richard's meetings, allowing them to capture compromising confessions. Everything was set for Richard's fall. The trap had been organized under the guise of a routine business meeting. Richard believed he was about to close a multi-million-dollar deal with foreign investors, an agreement that would strengthen his market position and increase his control over several strategic sectors. What he didn't know was that these investors were part of Leonard's plan and that everything was arranged to incriminate Richard. The meeting was scheduled to take place in a luxurious hotel in the city center, a place where Richard would feel safe, surrounded by his usual environment of luxury and discretion. The conference room had already been prepared by Nicholas, who had ensured that every word Richard uttered would be recorded. Everything had to go perfectly. Mary, amid it all, tried to remain calm. She had spent so much time preparing for this moment that now, as it was about to happen, she couldn't help but feel a knot in her stomach. Richard's downfall didn't just mean justice for Andres. It was also an opportunity to free herself from the shadows that had haunted her life for years. But the risk was enormous. If anything went wrong, Richard would discover the betrayal, and they, everyone, would be in grave danger. Hours before the meeting, Mary met with Leonard and Nicholas in a nearby cafe. The tension was palpable among them. They knew everything was about to be resolved, for better or worse. "Are you sure everything is ready?" Mary asked, trying to sound calmer than she felt. Nicholas nodded, his face serious yet confident. "I've checked everything. The microphones are installed and working perfectly. We have access to the conference room from multiple angles. Nothing will go wrong if Richard suspects nothing." Leonard, who had been silent, interjected. "This is our only chance, Mary. The media is already prepared. If we get the recording of Richard admitting his crimes, the news will explode in minutes. No one will be able to protect him once everything comes to light." Mary nodded, taking a deep breath. She knew they were prepared, but the fear lingered. Richard was not an easy man to deceive. Later, Rose joined them in the room they had rented near the hotel. She looked impeccable as always, but Mary could see the nervousness in her eyes. Rose also had much at stake. If Richard discovered her betrayal, she would lose everything: her life of luxury, her security, and possibly her very life. "Richard is on his way," Rose said as she entered. "He suspects nothing. He thinks this is just another routine business deal." Mary nodded, feeling her nerves pulse faster. It all came down to this moment. When it was time for the meeting, Mary, Leonard, and Nicholas headed to the hotel, making sure to stay in the shadows while Rose entered with Richard. From a nearby room, through monitors and headsets, Mary watched the meeting with her heart in her throat. Everything seemed to unfold as planned. Richard, confident, began speaking with the investors, boasting about his achievements, his power, and how he controlled the game of corruption. Nicholas adjusted the microphone in his headphones and gestured to Mary, indicating they were capturing everything. "This deal is just part of my network," Richard was saying. "I have friends everywhere, politicians, judges, businessmen. They all owe me favors, and I make sure they always win." He smiled arrogantly, as if he had already won. The investors asked directed questions to elicit more incriminating information from Richard. As he spoke, Mary felt her muscles tense. She was about to obtain what she had dreamed of since discovering the truth: irrefutable proof that Richard was responsible for Andres' death and for so many other lives ruined by his greed. However, something changed in Richard's expression. A flash of doubt crossed his gaze. He started looking around more carefully, as if he suddenly sensed that something was amiss. Mary held her breath, just like Nicholas and Leonard. Richard furrowed his brow, and his tone shifted. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice now tense and suspicious. The fake investors exchanged nervous glances, and before they could respond, Richard abruptly rose from his chair, staring intently at the leader of the group. "This is not what it seems, is it?" Nicholas cursed under his breath, his eyes fixed on the monitors. Shit, he suspects it. Before Richard could react, the police officers, who had been waiting outside the hotel, burst into the room. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Richard, surprised but not losing his composure, tried to resist. The officers' hands closed around him, and although he struggled, he couldn't prevent them from handcuffing him. Mary watched from the monitors. Their eyes met for a second, and she saw something she had never seen before. Confusion. Richard, for the first time, didn't understand how he had been caught. And then, in a last-ditch effort to buy time, he looked at the officers and shouted the words Mary had been waiting to hear for so long. "This is a mistake!" he yelled. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I have contacts. I've paid for all this. I have the signed agreements." There it was, the confession, the words that would sink him forever. Mary felt a mix of relief and exhaustion as she watched the officers escort him out of the room. The recording, captured in its entirety, would be the key piece that exposed everything. Richard Montenegro, the man who had controlled her life and destroyed Andres's, was finished. With Richard handcuffed, Rose joined Mary, Nicholas, and Leonard. The tension on her face melted away, replaced by a bittersweet smile. They had done it. "It's done," Rose said with a sigh. "He won't be able to hurt anyone anymore." Mary looked at her, feeling a mix of gratitude and understanding. She knew Rose had also paid a price for betraying Richard, but now, together, they had accomplished what seemed impossible. "Yes," Mary replied, her tone softer than she had expected. "It's done." The plan had worked. Richard Montenegro, the man who had built an empire on corruption and lies, was about to face justice. But Mary also knew that while the battle had been won, the war was far from over. There was still much to do, but for the first time in years, she felt she had regained control of her life. Mary left the hotel with Nicholas and Leonard by her side, ready to face the future now opening before her. The man who had destroyed her world no longer held power over her. The arrest of Richard Montenegro echoed in all the media the following day. The news showed him handcuffed, escorted by police officers, as cameras and microphones crowded around him. His face, once synonymous with power and prestige, now reflected the defeat of a man caught in his own web of corruption. Richard's downfall was immediate and resounding. Judges, businessmen, and politicians who had once protected him rushed to distance themselves to avoid being dragged into the scandal. His empire was crumbling. Mary watched the news from the small shelter where she had spent the last few years. It was a moment of triumph, but also of closure. The justice she had fought so hard for, the justice she had sought not only for herself, but for Andres, had finally been fulfilled. However, now that everything was over, a sense of emptiness began to creep in. She had dedicated so much time and energy to this struggle that, for the first time, she wondered what she would do with her life moving forward. A few days after the arrest, Mary was summoned for a formal meeting with the authorities and the lawyers handling Richard's case. Nicholas accompanied her, his face serious, yet showing a slight nod of approval. Leonard, who had published an extensive article on Richard's corrupt empire, was also there. Rose had not reappeared since the meeting, having withdrawn discreetly to avoid public scrutiny, although Mary knew the woman was in a safe place, out of reach of her now incarcerated husband. During the meeting, the lawyers confirmed that, thanks to the evidence collected, Richard was facing a string of charges for corruption, bribery, fraud, and involuntary manslaughter related to the accident that caused Andres's death. The truth had come to light, and justice would take its course. "We want to thank you for your courage," one of the lawyers said. "Without your cooperation, this wouldn't have been possible." Mary nodded, but inside she felt that words couldn't encapsulate what she had been through. She had lost her husband, lost her home, and had been on the brink of losing herself. Yet she hadn't. And although the journey had been long and painful, she could now see a future beyond the suffering. That night, Mary returned to the shelter, and as she gazed at the sky from the window, she realized something important. She had achieved what Andres would have wanted. She had found the truth and made those responsible pay for what they had done to him and so many others. However, the true victory wasn't in Richard's downfall, but in the fact that Mary had managed to stay true to herself, even when circumstances tried to break her. Weeks later, with Richard's case concluding and media attention fading away from her, Mary decided it was time to change her life. She could no longer remain on the streets. It was time to start anew. With the compensation she received after Richard's conviction, Mary rented a small apartment, modest yet cozy. It was her own space, something she hadn't had in years. Every corner of the apartment was a symbol of her new life, of the freedom she had regained after losing everything. But Mary didn't just think of herself. Her experience of living on the streets, knowing hunger, cold, and loneliness, had left a deep mark on her heart. She knew there were many people like her, forgotten by the system, who needed a chance to rise again. That's when a new idea, a new mission, was born within her. With the money she had left, Mary decided to open a shelter for the homeless. It wouldn't just be a place where they could find a bed and a warm meal, but a space that offered emotional support and tools to rebuild their lives. She knew from her own experience that a helping hand could make the difference between giving up and continuing to fight. Haley, her old street companion, was the first person she invited to join this project. Though Haley had always been cynical about life, when she saw what Mary was building, something changed in her. Over time, she became one of the shelter's coordinators, helping those who arrived with the same distrust she had felt for years. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," Haley confessed one day as she served coffee to a newly arrived woman at the shelter. Mary smiled warmly. "Life changes, Haley, and so do we." Nicholas, after helping Mary take down Richard, decided to leave his career as a private detective. For years, he had worked in the shadows, but his experience with Mary made him realize he could use his skills for something better. He joined the shelter team, helping people find jobs and rebuild their lives. He was also seeking redemption, and through his work with Mary, he was finding it. A solid friendship developed between them, and although they never spoke directly about what had happened during the previous months, both knew they shared an experience that had profoundly changed them. Nicholas, the man who had once been a hunter of secrets, was now dedicated to protecting the most vulnerable. Leonard, after the success of his article, continued his path as a journalist. Though Richard's downfall was a monumental achievement, for him it was just one battle in the larger war against corruption. He kept in touch with Mary, but knew she had a new path to follow. To Leonard, Mary was not just a source of information. She was one of the bravest people he had ever met. The shelter grew. Within months, more and more people arrived seeking a new opportunity, and Mary was there to offer support. On the walls of the shelter hung a small photo of Andres, one Mary had kept during all those difficult years. He had been her inspiration to fight, and now his memory was what drove Mary to move forward. Looking at the lively shelter, Mary knew she had fulfilled what Andres would have wanted. She had achieved justice and found a purpose greater than her pain. Mary's journey, which began with loss and despair, ended in redemption and hope. She had been a homeless woman, lost in the darkness of the city, but her integrity and strength had led her to find a new path. And so, under the lights of the city that once forgotten her, Mary walked toward the future, knowing that while the past would never be erased, she had learned to live with it and to move on. Her story was not just one of survival, but of transformation. And now, it was a story of hope for all those who, like her, once believed there was no tomorrow. And thus, we reach the end of this incredible story of struggle, justice, and redemption. If you enjoyed Mary's journey from the shadows of the city to becoming a symbol of hope for many, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories filled with drama, emotion, and powerful messages. Remember, there is always light at the end of the road, and every action counts in transforming our lives and those around us. Thank you for joining us on this adventure and for being part of our community. Leave your comments below, tell us what you thought and what lessons you take from this story. See you in the next video, and as always, never stop believing in the power of truth and justice. See you soon.